Once upon a time at the University of California, Los Angeles, a student played a prank on one of his classmates. Mike Morheim saw Alan Adham step away from his computer for a minute and decided to quickly change his password to Joe. Unsuspecting of this treachery, Adham came back, typed in his password, and logged back on. Morheim was stunned. How had Adham gotten through? So Morheim went to Adham, confessed his prank, and asked how he'd beaten him. But Adham was equally surprised. He just put in his password. And then it hit Morheim. By complete coincidence, Joe had been Adham's password in the first place. From then on, the two classmates became close friends. So close that they ended up going into business together. 20 years, dozens of titles, and one of the greatest legacies in gaming history later, their studio has emerged as one of the single most powerful forces in all of entertainment, a company so popular that they warrant their own convention. Whether or not they still use Joe as their password, there can be no doubt that there are few companies in the world that have the same reputation for flawless execution and consistent excellence as Blizzard Entertainment. After he graduated, Alan Adham decided there was no better time to follow his dream. He loved playing games, so why not get paid to make them? But he didn't want to be some low-level code monkey for a major corporation. He wanted to be his own boss, working on his own schedule. He wanted to start his own company. So he called up Mike Morheim and asked him to join him on his venture, and he also called another classmate of his, Frank Pierce.
I met Alan through a mutual acquaintance at school, and it was really fortunate because I really felt like I wanted to make games. Thought that would be a really cool career, but really had no idea how I would go about doing that. But Alan actually had a very specific plan and a very specific vision for what he wanted to do, and I personally feel very fortunate that I happened to cross paths with someone that knew how he wanted to do exactly what I was also interested in.
I didn't meet Frank until the first day we started the company. I showed up and there Frank was. That was when we met.
And so on February 8th, 1991, they founded Silicon and Synapse in Costa Mesa, California. Adham would be president, Morheim vice president, and Pierce would be their programmer. Their mission was to make great games and have fun while doing it.
I'm not sure that Mike and I were actually convinced that we could start a game company and actually succeed at that, but Alan was very passionate and very optimistic and felt like if you put a bunch of smart people in a room together that they would be very capable of figuring out how to do whatever it was they needed to do to make games or really to do anything else. I mean, Alan's always said there's no substitute for hard work. And I think he just felt like if we put enough time and effort into it, there wouldn't be anything we wouldn't be able to figure out.
Alan told us that making games wasn't rocket science, and that if we put our minds together, we were smart guys, and we should be able to compete with the best of them.
And right there, that first year, they made a name for themselves. In 1991, they released RPM Racing for the brand new Super Nintendo, a game influenced by the earlier Racing Destruction set for the Commodore 64. In making it, Silicon and Synapse had become the first American studio to put out a game for that system. Not too bad a start. 1992 was a little different. Instead of making their own games, they ported a number of already released titles onto other platforms. They brought The Lord of the Rings to the Amiga and Battle Chess to Windows, among many others. It wasn't exactly the most exciting work in the world, but it paid well. But of course, their real passion was in making new games, and that same year they released The Lost Vikings for a variety of platforms. The Lost Vikings featured 3 Vikings who are, what else but, sucked into a spaceship by the evil Tomator and have to escape. It was an action platformer, but with a unique twist. The player could cycle through each of the 3 Viking characters at will, which he'd have to do since each one had unique abilities necessary to solve the puzzles. It was a sort of single multiplayer game. It also boasted a fantastic art design and wonderful sense of humor, and was an early indicator of the kind of personality and quality that would later define the company.
it was different and special for us because it was really our first completely original title. So yeah, we had a great time working on that game, and we learned a lot of our early sort of game design lessons and lessons about the value of iteration.
You mean with Lost Vikings, it's certainly something that you run across people on the street and they say, oh, I played Lost Vikings, it was a really cool game. And I think it has some sort of appeal that you can't really quantify for people, which is really cool.
The game went on to become an icon of the company's early work and was followed by a sequel in 1995. With the release of Rock and Roll Racing for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis in 1993, Silicon and Synapse was starting to make a name for itself. That year even saw them win their first award for Best Software Developer from Video Games Magazine. The trouble was, the name itself wasn't working. Silicon and Synapse was supposed to be a cute term for the combination of technology and creativity, but sadly, none of the business people they dealt with knew what a synapse was. It was just confusing people, and the young company didn't need to be doing that. So they rebranded themselves as the name they wanted to be known by forevermore: Chaos Studios. There were larger issues as well. For one, even with just a handful of guys doing what they loved, the atmosphere was hardly relaxed.
I remember at the beginning, I remember it being hard work and long hours. I remember our schedule today I feel like is very relaxed compared to our schedule back then, because I worked in the aerospace industry before I started with Silicon and Synapse, and I used to get to work at 7 a.m. And so I actually continued that trend when I started working on games, and we used to show up to the office between 7 and 7:30 in the morning and work at least a 10 or 12 hour day.
I was never here at 7 a.m., but I worked very late.
Worse, even for all their success, the numbers weren't adding up. They only had 15 employees, and yet to make payroll, the founders were having to take advances on their credit cards and even beg their parents for money. When even the allowance started to run dry, they knew something had to change. So in 1994, Chaos Studios seriously considered a pair of acquisition offers. One was from major publisher Interplay, the other from educational software developer Davidson and Associates. Initially, the choice seemed obvious. The young company wanted to join into one of gaming's biggest stars. But after thinking about it some more, they realized that at Interplay they'd just be another cog in the wheel and wouldn't have the freedom to do whatever they wanted. By contrast, Davidson and Associates didn't know the first thing about the gaming world, and therefore was willing to let the guys have absolute free reign over their products. It was a tough decision, but in the end, the guys took the gamble on the gaming newbies. Davidson acquired Chaos for $10 million. The influx of cash was a desperately needed break for the studio.
I think the Davidson acquisition was really important. It really accelerated our growth. A lot of people don't know this, but up until the Davidson acquisition, we were really on a tight budget. We didn't even have a local area network at the office. So we were passing around discs and everything. We were trying to make the transition to start self-funding and self-publishing our own games. We didn't have to worry about making payroll anymore. We had a pretty fast local area network now, and we were able to just focus on the games.
But just as things were finally getting stable, Chaos found that they could no longer be Chaos. Another software company owned the rights to that name, so, once again, they had to change it. They almost went with Ogre Studios, but their bosses at Davidson weren't happy with that choice. Finally, Adham grabbed 7 words out of the dictionary. After a lengthy process, they settled on a name that was both cool and had the blessing of their owners: Blizzard Entertainment. Even at this early stage in their development, the newly minted Blizzard chose the word entertainment as opposed to something like games, because they didn't want to limit themselves to one medium. Ambition was something the guys never lacked. Later that year, the newly named Blizzard Entertainment was asked by publisher Sunsoft to adapt the biggest event in comic book history: the death of Superman. The death and return of Superman for the Super Nintendo released in August as a basic beat-em-up game, but with Superman. And at the end of the game, you wouldn't beat the final boss. Rather, you'd kill each other, and then start the game all over again as one of the 4 other Supermen, and only if you played through as all 5 of them would you get the final ending. For Blizzard, it was a testament to the reputation they'd earned. In only 3 years, they had been entrusted with one of the biggest names in all of entertainment. In September of that year, they released another original game, the shooter platformer Blackthorn for the SNES and DOS. To get the motions looking as realistic as possible, the crew recorded Frank Pierce's movements and then converted the video into the game's graphics, a process called rotoscoping. The game once again featured a distinctive art direction and a quirky sense of humor, another step on the road to the emerging Blizzard style. So, 1994 had been a big year. The company had been acquired, changed its name, released a game based on no less than Superman, and released another game of their own, Blackthorn. What more could one small developer possibly do in a year? Well, as it turned out, they had one more game to release for the holidays. They would close out '94 with a little game called Warcraft. 2 years earlier, Westwood Studios had released Dune 2, a strategy game in which the player had to manage his resources in order to build new structures that would in turn produce units that could fight the enemy. This game style was so different that it became its own genre, real-time strategy, or RTS. The game had been a modest success, but by 1994, not a single new RTS had been released. Blizzard, however, had plans of its own.
Dune 2 came out, and I remember that just light bulbs were going on in our brains. We just thought it was the coolest thing. And but it was single player, and we thought that it would just be really awesome to have a real-time strategy game that you could play with another person. Of course, we always try to set everything in a fantasy universe. So
that was our formula for success at the time.
Since the complex controls for an RTS didn't map very well onto a controller, Warcraft would be Blizzard's first game to be exclusive to the PC. It would also be the first game they published by themselves, making use of Davidson's already strong distribution arm. The game itself was almost perfectly balanced between its two factions, because its two factions were practically identical. Each side's units did the same damage and had the same health, with only a few exceptions. That being said, the art design was gorgeous and the fantasy setting provided for a fun story. Beyond that, it had multiplayer. This was limited to LAN, or if the player knew how, a direct connection to another IP address, but it still made for some heated head-to-head strategic combat that literally no other game had. It didn't hurt at all that this was the first real-time strategy game since the first real-time strategy game, so the market was wide open. Warcraft Orcs and Humans was well received and reached solid sales. Nothing mind-blowing, but it was strong enough for Blizzard's owners, Davidson and Associates, to greenlight a sequel. The guys were doing well now. They had enough money to grow the company, they were starting to obtain a fan base, and they had complete creative freedom. And they'd done it all in only 4 years. And with Warcraft already out the door, they thought the sequel might do even better. They had no idea. After graduating from the University of California, Los Angeles, 3 friends decided to take a risk and start their own video game company. Silicon and Synapse got off to a good start, developing the first American-made game for the Super Nintendo with RPM Racing. After producing a number of ports, they went on to create a number of original titles like The Lost Vikings and Rock and Roll Racing. 1994 saw the young company go through a number of changes, including their acquisition by Davidson and Associates, and a renaming to Blizzard Entertainment. Alongside the platformer Blackthorn, Blizzard released Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Warcraft was only the second entrant into the real-time strategy genre, and was the first RTS to have multiplayer. With good reviews and solid sales across the board, Blizzard was starting to find its feet. Warcraft had been the first game they'd self-published. So going into 1995, they had a number of sequels they wanted to work on, and were also looking to expand their publishing business. And in so doing, began their ascent to the top of their industry. During 1994, Blizzard had once again been commissioned to make a game based on DC Comics superheroes. Justice League Task Force was to take the comic book icons into the fighting realm, a genre that had recently become popular. To make it, publisher Acclaim had contracted multiple developers. While Blizzard was put to work on the Super Nintendo version, another studio in Redwood City, Condor Entertainment, created the Genesis version. Though the two teams had never worked together, by chance, Blizzard CEO Alan Adham had met some of Condor's leads at a convention. Then in January 1995, Blizzard got an unexpected phone call. It was from Condor. They were working on a new game, an original idea of their own, and they were looking for a publisher. They'd gone to every single major publisher, and then a couple of little publishers, but all of them had turned them down. They all thought Condor was insane. With no PC experience, they wanted to craft a turn-based claymation action RPG in an epic story. Now, the Condor team was so desperate, they were turning to guys they'd bumped into once at a convention. But Blizzard saw something in the project. They thought there was an opportunity here to produce a top-notch game the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. And so, Blizzard agreed and signed the lucky developer as the first outside studio to publish through them. The working title of the game was Diablo. As Condor continued to roll on their game, Blizzard finished up The Lost Vikings 2: Norse by Northwest. Our three plucky lads once again are kidnapped by Tomator, but this time they augment themselves with some of his futuristic gear, and are even joined by a dragon and a werewolf. Gameplay-wise, this meant more characters and more abilities for each of them, though the player was still limited to 3 characters at a time. The game was well received, though it didn't leave the same impact as its predecessor. But in the meantime, Blizzard was working on another sequel, and this one would blow its predecessor away. Warcraft 2: Tides of Darkness released in December 1995. On the surface of it, it looked a lot like its predecessor. It was a fantasy real-time strategy game with 2 largely identical factions. But in 100 little details, it refined the formula to perfection.
I would definitely say that Warcraft 2 is probably the game that, where I really think you start to see the Blizzard polish sort of bloom in the form of a really awesome game. Not to say that the games we created before that weren't awesome as well, but I just think that that's where we really started to shine.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also Warcraft 2 was sort of like turning everything up a notch. It was more players, it was higher resolution, it was land, sea, and air. We had been working on Warcraft for a year, so the team already really knew what it was doing in terms of developing that game.
Of Warcraft 2's many changes, one of the most significant to its genre was persistent fog of war. In earlier RTS games, once an area of the map had been explored, the player could always see it. In Warcraft 2, a player would only have sight on a location if he had a unit there to watch it. It made scouting an integral part of the experience, and has since become universal in strategy titles. Blizzard's humor and personality blossomed into something truly special with this title, from the epic storyline to the unit responses.
What? Look out! Missed me! Ew, that tickles!
The creation of such a vibrant world with its own sense of character has since become a distinguishing feature of the company. Another major addition was the expansion of multiplayer's capabilities. Warcraft 2 could do much more than just head-to-head. Teams of up to 4 players each could now go at it in massive battles of incredible strategic complexity. However, it was still limited to local networks or a direct IP connection. However, earlier that year, a couple of enthusiasts had coded a program that would allow different LAN games to be played over the internet. The program was called Kali. This program, which had nothing directly to do with Blizzard, catapulted Warcraft 2 to towering success.
And with Warcraft 1, it was a cool game, it was a fun game, but you were really limited in terms of the community of people that you could play with. And so I really think that the homegrown community that grew around Warcraft 2 on the internet was a big factor. I mean, it's just sort of, it's word of mouth that you just can't put a price on.
And there was one other multiplayer match being played, the one between Blizzard and the creators of the RTS genre, Westwood Studios. Just a few months before Warcraft 2, they had finally released a new strategy game of their own, Command & Conquer. That game was also a finely polished strategy masterpiece, and the release of the two great games so close to each other ignited a craze for the genre. Of course, each title generated its own fans, and the young internet burst into one of its first flame wars over which title was superior. Then, as now, the idea that different people could enjoy different games was unacceptable. Of course, all the noise just made them both more visible. The result was a monster hit for Blizzard. In just 4 months, Warcraft 2 sold 500,000 copies, astounding for a little studio in 1995. It would eventually cross the magic 1 million sold mark, an honor only few games had achieved up to that time. Not bad for a game made in only 10 months. After the game had been well established as a hit, Blizzard decided that they wanted an expansion pack for it. As they were already starting to roll onto other projects, however, they handed Beyond the Dark Portal over to developer Cyberlore Studios, who finished the expansion in 1996. Meanwhile, Condor was still hard at work on Diablo. Their turn-based claymation RPG combat game was coming along nicely. But their new publisher, Blizzard, insisted they make some changes. First of all, they wanted them to switch from claymation to 3D graphics, since 3D was quickly emerging as the wave of the future, and because claymation was just bonkers. In addition, Blizzard wanted Condor to switch from turn-based to real-time. Condor resisted at first. All the work they'd done was based on turns. Communication between the two studios became something of an issue.
Yeah, I would say that dealing with a studio remotely it was a huge challenge for us at the time. I mean, we were really young and new to project management, still relatively new to the industry and new to making games, and so to be working with a studio that was not nearby was a big challenge.
Finally, they agreed to make a real-time tech demo, just to see how it played. Almost immediately, Condor realized how much more exciting real-time was. After that, Condor went real-time, full-time. Pretty soon, it was obvious to Blizzard that Condor was onto something massive. That was it. They didn't want to publish it anymore. They wanted to own it.
Condor was developing Diablo, and the project was going so well, and we enjoyed working with them so much that we wanted to make them internal studio part of Blizzard. So we talked to Davidson and Associates, our parent company, and they were excited about the idea, and so in a very short time, Condor became Blizzard North.
At E3 1996, the game was finally revealed to the public. It generated great buzz. No one had ever seen a game like it before, and after Warcraft 2, Blizzard was one of the hottest developers in the world. That same E3, Blizzard also had 2 other reveals. The first was Battle.net, a free online multiplayer service that would be included with every copy of Diablo. No longer would players have to fall back on the third-party Kali. Blizzard would provide its own finely polished matchmaking service so that people could play random games over the internet. The final reveal was a less welcome surprise. A boring science fiction clone of Warcraft with the knockoff title, StarCraft. While the Blizzard booth originally had 3 monitors for Diablo and 3 for StarCraft, by the end of the show, StarCraft was down to 1 monitor. It didn't look any better than last year's Warcraft 2, and more important, it didn't look any different. While Blizzard North was busy making a game like no one had ever seen before, their southern cousin seemed to be cannibalizing itself. When the show was over, Blizzard had to decide what to do with the project. They were already well into development on the game, but the reaction had been underwhelming, to say the least.
That E3, there were quite a lot of other real-time strategy games in development, and a lot of them looked quite good. And we came back to the office and we were just talking about sort of the state of the genre and the state of the where the RTS genre was going, and we realized that we needed to step it up with StarCraft.
In the end, they made a hard call. Rather than release a mediocre product, they chose to scrap the work they'd done and start over from scratch. StarCraft would not see the light of day again for years. Diablo, on the other hand, had connected with its audience and was set to conquer the market. However, to make sure the game was just right, Blizzard ended up missing its planned holiday release for 1996.
I mean, when we were finishing Diablo down the stretch, we had guys from the Irvine office that had gone up there and were basically living up there temporarily, helping finish the game. And BattleNet development was taking place in Irvine. So we were coordinating BattleNet platform and the Diablo development and our support for the development of the game and getting out the door. We actually brought the large majority of the StarCraft team down to help ship the first Diablo game.
What a lot of people don't realize too is the decision to have Diablo playable on BattleNet wasn't made until very late in that project. That was not an idea we'd been working on for very long. In fact, I think the entire BattleNet development took place in a matter of months.
In fact, they finished the game on December 26th, missing Christmas trees everywhere by just one day. It finally hit store shelves on January 2nd, 1997, and smashed. Diablo's combination of RPG upgrades and action mechanics was unbeatable. A fully realized world was fleshed out by an epic storyline that perfectly complemented the gameplay. What was more, no two gamers would play the same experience. Diablo's levels were randomly generated, which meant that every time the player ran through it, he'd experience new dungeons, items, and enemies. It gave Diablo an incredible replay value that static games could only dream of. And a player could enter into these random dungeons with others. Co-op multiplayer was supported, allowing up to 4 heroes to help each other smite their foes. Sadly, the co-op had friendly fire turned on, which meant that one player could kill another. This led to many players just killing off all their teammates for a few chuckles. How diabolical. On top of the game itself, Diablo was the first project of Blizzard's new cinematics team. Their job was to create high-quality pre-rendered cutscenes to give Blizzard's game a cinematic flair that no other studio could match. Those first scenes might look pretty dated today, but they were the beginning of one of Blizzard's signature features. It all combined into another monster success. Diablo became Blizzard's second game in a row to cross the 1 million sold mark, which, again, only a handful of games had done up to that point. Blizzard was now one of the most prominent developers in the entire business. Their games had a level of polish, presentation, and personality that no one else seemed able to achieve. Their only real problem was that sci-fi knockoff of Warcraft they were still kicking around. It was taking even longer than expected to make it any good. The question was, would StarCraft ever become something Blizzard could be proud of? Tune in next time to see Blizzard create a gaming legend.
I remember one morning I came into the office to work on, and we were working on Warcraft 2 at the time, and I went to copy down. We didn't use revision control of any kind for our source code or our data or anything at the time, so all of the source code and data and everything was stored on the network. And I went to copy down the latest version of everything from the network, and the folder that everything was supposed to be in was gone. And it turns out one of the developers the night before, late that night, one of the guys in QA was trying to delete the directory from his local hard drive, but actually ran the deltree command on the network hard drive, so when everyone came in the next morning, it was completely gone. And so he lives on today with the infamous nickname of Deltree. Dave Haley still works here. Oh.
By the end of 1997, Blizzard Entertainment was on a roll. From its humble origins as 3 college grads with a dream, it had risen to unparalleled success with 2 games in a row selling over 1 million copies. Warcraft 2 was a real-time strategy game with a huge multiplayer fanbase, and Diablo was an action RPG hybrid the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. Warcraft 2 had come from Blizzard's main base in Irvine, California, while Diablo broke out of their first expansion, Blizzard North, up in San Mateo. Between the 2 teams and their 2 games, Blizzard seemed to own the PC market. But there was a problem. The Irvine team's current project had failed its first test. The game was similar to Warcraft in every way, except that it was in space. Even the name sounded almost identical: StarCraft. Fans and critics who saw it at E3 1996 were unimpressed, to say the least. But with 2 mammoth hits under its belt, Blizzard had the resources to begin again. So as their northern cousins got to work on Diablo 2, the southern team scrapped the StarCraft project and started over from scratch. The results of both teams are among the most legendary titles ever made. Not surprisingly, the massively popular Diablo was followed by an expansion pack. However, like the Warcraft 2 expansion Beyond the Dark Portal before it, Hellfire was not made by Blizzard. Rather, the title was outsourced to Synergistic Software and produced in time for a November 1997 release. The Blizzard North team had a more important project to worry about: a full sequel. That game wouldn't be seen for years. In the meantime, their southern cousins were at last putting the finishing touches on StarCraft. It finally released in March 1998. They retooled the game from the ground up to make it look, play, and feel like a completely different animal. It was still a real-time strategy game with resources, buildings, and units, but everything else had changed. The three races were no longer carbon copies of one another. Every race was unique. What worked for one race wouldn't even be possible for another. This made the strategy of any given match exponentially more complex, since the player would have to play differently depending on which race he was facing. On top of this, StarCraft took storytelling to the next level. Warcraft 2 had featured a fun tale, but it had been told in cutscenes between missions by a faceless voice. The Orc and human campaigns were distinct entities experienced separately. By contrast, StarCraft told one continuous storyline, beginning with the human race, followed by a feral alien race, and concluded by an advanced alien race. It would be told through the interactions of various characters, and many of these characters would then be played in the missions themselves. In fact, those characters would continue to communicate with one another during the missions. In other words, the narrative and the game formed one seamless entertainment experience. No other RTS had done the same.
We think the backstory is really important to create a sense of immersion, a purpose for why it is that you're doing whatever you have to do within the game. But ultimately, one of our core values at Blizzard is gameplay first, and gameplay really trumps anything. And so if there's a gameplay reason why something is more fun than something else, we try to work the backstory around that so it supports the more fun gameplay.
And then there was this little thing called the multiplayer. StarCraft fully supported Blizzard's Battle.net service for matchmaking support. While conceptually little changed from Warcraft 2's feature set, the deep mechanics and three completely different races made for endless possibilities. It became addicting to a level no one had ever seen before. So, did it sell? Let's put it this way. Warcraft 2 and Diablo had been gigantic successes by selling 1 million copies each. StarCraft also sold 1 million copies. In South Korea alone. Not only was that 2% of that country's entire population, but it meant that when combined with all other markets, StarCraft grew into one of the best-selling PC games of all time. The burgeoning professional gaming leagues immediately latched onto the title, and StarCraft will be played at esports events over a decade after its release. A decade. That's an eternity in the gaming world. In South Korea, StarCraft remains to this day as a massive spectator sport on the level of traditional sports. When all was said and done, StarCraft sold 11 million units. Before, Blizzard had been one of the most successful developers in the world. Now, it was unrivaled. From story to mechanics to presentation, they had redefined what strategy games, and the medium in general, were capable of. Such was its impact that in May 1999, the Space Shuttle Discovery took a copy on board for the first docking mission of the International Space Station. Blizzard could have released a so-so product. By refusing to do so, they created an icon. Not surprisingly, expansion packs for the game followed shortly. As with earlier Blizzard games, the first two were made by third parties. Insurrection, developed and published by Aztec New Media, was a side story to the main narrative, with a new campaign for each race. Retribution, developed by Stardock, was much the same, also featuring a new campaign for each race. Neither of these expansions were well received critically and were not produced in high volume. They are largely forgotten and unavailable today. But in November of 1998, the final StarCraft expansion was released, and this one was a gigantic hit. Brood War expanded on the core game in every way, not only continuing the story, but driving it into bold new territory, while also overhauling and expanding the multiplayer. It should be no surprise that this expansion was not made by outsiders, but by Blizzard itself, albeit with some help from developer Sapphire. It is the only StarCraft expansion still in wide availability. It was also the last StarCraft product to release for quite some time. In all this bedazzling success, it was easy to miss Blizzard's failure for the year. Warcraft Adventures: Lord of the Clans was supposed to be an adventure game following the exploits of Thrall, an orc slave who would escape and become, what else but, Lord of the Clans. Unfortunately, though some guys in Blizzard were really passionate about it, others didn't feel the love. Some people didn't think it lived up to Blizzard's golden standards, and by 1998, both 2D and the adventure genre were practically dead. It also didn't help that the game's developer, Animation Magic, was based out of Russia, which made it hard for Blizzard to communicate with them. Worse, just when they were getting ready to release the game, LucasArts announced Monkey Island 3 and Grim Fandango, two adventure games that Blizzard felt were pushing the boundaries of the adventure genre more than Warcraft Adventures. And that was a serious problem. If they released the game against the LucasArts titles, fans would see the Blizzard effort as just another adventure game. Eventually, the news came out. Blizzard had canceled the project, supposedly only 3 months before development would have finished. Once again, they proved that they would rather not release a game than release one that wasn't perfect. 1998 had one other change in store for the guys. The company's co-founder, Alan Adham, who had come up with the idea for a game studio in the first place, stepped down as president of Blizzard Entertainment. As president, he was only involved with the business side of things. He wanted to get back to actually making games. As such, he swapped positions with fellow co-founder Mike Morhaime. Morhaime remains president to this day. 1999 would end up being a much lighter year for the company. They wouldn't actually release anything that year, even though Diablo 2 had been slated for the holiday season. Its delay was disappointing to fans, but at this point, it was almost expected that Blizzard would delay a product to get it right. They did announce in September that Warcraft 3 was coming. The game would hybridize the two genres the studio was most famous for, real-time strategy and role-playing games. Even for Blizzard, this was an ambitious undertaking, with 6 playable races and a hero unit that the camera would be locked onto at all times, just like in Diablo. Other units would be ordered around by the hero, instead of being directly controlled by the player. The game would be one seamless experience, with dialogue sequences between characters taking the place of static load screens. Fans ate it up, expecting nothing less than perfection from Blizzard. There was just one little problem. Only after the announcement had already been made did Blizzard whip up an internal demo of the experience. And they hated it. As soon as they tried their own idea, they realized how bad it was. So at E3 2000, Blizzard dropped a bombshell and declared that they were completely overhauling Warcraft 3, moving it much closer to a traditional RTS while still retaining the focus on hero units. There was a backlash to this since it meant yet another delay, and also seemed to move the game away from innovation and back into safe territory. Not for the last time, people started to whisper that, good though their games were, they were all kind of derivative of each other. But only a month later, Blizzard wrested their good name back. In June 2000, Diablo 2 finally released. Blizzard North, the makers of the first Diablo, had been in crunch mode on the game for months, meaning they'd been working nights and weekends for nearly a year. Their intention to make the sequel bigger in every way had gotten away from them. Diablo 2 had a longer story, larger levels, more classes, new abilities, and tons of weapons. Getting it all to work had nearly broken their backs. But it was worth it. Diablo 2 was an action masterpiece, an adrenaline-fueled descent into the depths of hell itself. It wasn't without its flaws. The graphics barely looked better than its 4-year-old predecessor, and Battle.net servers crashed constantly during the game's opening weeks. But none of that could counteract the intuitive and addicting gameplay. Diablo 2 became Blizzard's fastest-selling game to date, reaching 1 million sales in only a month. The game is often cited as the best action RPG ever made. Without any question whatsoever, Blizzard was now one of the most respected and successful developers in the world. every game they released cleared 1 million units with ease and quickly became known as a classic of its medium. They had dominated the 90s, and now the 2000s were theirs for the taking. Throughout the 1990s, Blizzard Entertainment had risen from unlikely startup to the most powerful force in PC gaming. Early successes with their Warcraft and Diablo games had led to even more successful sequels. After a rough start, their StarCraft game had turned into one of the legends of the art form. Since 1995, every single game they had released sold 1 million units or more, and the numbers were rising with every year. They had complete creative and financial freedom. They could do whatever they wanted, make games as wild and diverse as they felt like. But for a variety of reasons, the early 2000s saw a series of failed developments and major resignations, and in the end, only 2 games from their established Warcraft franchise would see the light of day. But as it happened, those 2 games became some of the most respected, influential, and successful games of all time. Even when things looked at their worst, the Blizzard reputation shined through. After finishing StarCraft Brood War in November 1998, Blizzard's main team in Irvine, California split into 2. While one went to work on the studio's next real-time strategy game, Warcraft 3, the other began work on a brand new IP, a sci-fi role-playing game called Nomad. Sadly, the Nomad project never really got off the ground, and eventually, it was shuttered before even being announced. Which meant that the team had to find something else to do. However, the company's other studio, Blizzard North, was on a roll. After completing Diablo 2 in 2000, they went on to do the expansion pack themselves. Previously, nearly all Blizzard expansions had been done by third parties. But starting with Brood War, Blizzard started doing all their expansions internally by the same teams that had made the core game. The strategy worked again, as Lord of Destruction went on to be a success after its release in June 2001. Immediately after that, Blizzard North began rolling on Diablo 3. Unlike the uncertainty of their southern cousins, who had met failures with both the adventure game Warcraft Adventures and the Nomad project, the northern studio seemed to be in complete control. Little did they know that they would never release a game again. In September 2001, Blizzard announced a new game. It was the follow-up project for the Nomad team. A good number of those guys had been playing massively multiplayer online games, or MMOs for short.
As the Nomad project was progressing and it wasn't really shaping up, we decided to change direction for the team. They wanted to work on an MMO. We talked about what franchise made sense, whether we should do a new world or if we should try to leverage one of the existing worlds. And when we looked at the Warcraft franchise, we really felt like it just seemed like the right fit.
The result would be World of Warcraft. However, in typical Blizzard fashion, no release date was given and the game wouldn't be seen for years as the team tried to make it just right. In the meantime, the southern studio was finishing up the other Warcraft game. Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos released in July 2002, a vastly changed beast from the original concept. Its 6 promised races had been reduced to 4. Its much-hyped heroes were now just powerful units instead of the player's own character. It was, in other words, a standard traditional RTS, with the heroes just adding in some extra flavor. However, it was still a leap forward in several respects. For one thing, it was Blizzard's first fully 3D game, although that didn't impact gameplay too much in this case. For another, the quality of the studio's pre-rendered cutscenes reached a whole new level. These allowed the team to flesh out the narrative into a sweeping epic that nevertheless stayed focused on its characters, making for the most story-driven strategy game to date. Complementing the writing was Blizzard's trademark balanced gameplay and completely different factions. When all combined, the end result was a game that is to this day considered one of the finest strategy titles ever made. As with StarCraft before it, it went on to be a staple of professional gaming tournaments worldwide. It should be no surprise that the game was followed by an expansion pack, 2003's The Frozen Throne. As with Diablo 2's expansion, this one would be made by the same team that made the core game, ensuring that it would keep the same tone while living up to the same standards of quality. The result was almost a whole new game, with another huge story and new units for multiplayer. So now all three of Blizzard's major franchises were rolling on new projects. Blizzard North had Diablo 3 in development, Blizzard's southern base had World of Warcraft and a sequel to StarCraft in development, and another developer, Nihilistic Software, had a brand new StarCraft game in the works. Begun in 2002 for a 2003 release, StarCraft Ghost was to be a third-person action game for consoles. Blizzard hadn't made a game specifically for consoles since 1995, but this game was perfectly suited for that format. It would follow an elite human operative within the broader StarCraft narrative, and the reaction from fans was fantastic. Over the years, many screenshots, trailers, and articles would be released. What wouldn't release was an actual game. In true Blizzard fashion, it was delayed and overhauled again and again. As if the Ghost team's problems weren't enough, in June 2003, the leaders of the Diablo project left Blizzard North. Those guys had originally founded their own studio, Condor, only to be bought out and absorbed into Blizzard, which was itself owned by a larger corporation. Feeling like they weren't involved with the big decisions anymore, and unable to guarantee their own employees' compensations and futures, the Blizzard North executives protested. They even went so far as to tender their resignations unless they were heard. Unfortunately, those resignations were accepted. The Diablo team lost their leaders, a blow they would never recover from. Not to be outdone, in January 2004, the original Blizzard team lost their own leader. When Alan Adham had graduated from college, he whipped up a plan to start his own game company on his own terms. 13 years later, he chose to leave it behind. He stated that the long hours and high stress had finally gotten to him, and he now wished to pursue a career in finance. His co-founder Mike Morhaime had already taken over as president, so the company didn't undergo any major changes with his departure. Then later that same year, Blizzard dropped Nihilistic Software as developer of StarCraft Ghost, which was still in production with no end in sight. However, the Irvine crew still believed in the project and brought in Swingin' Ape Studios to take control. Swingin' Ape would eventually be acquired by Blizzard outright and would be rebranded as Blizzard Console. From then on, nothing associated with Blizzard would be made by anyone but Blizzard. So they got to work on StarCraft Ghost. Once again, it failed to release. Meanwhile, Blizzard's own StarCraft game, the direct sequel StarCraft 2, was nowhere near completion. With all these troubles and resignations piling up on top of each other, some began to say that Blizzard's reign at the top had ended. Then in November 2004, 10 years after the original Warcraft released, World of Warcraft came out. In development for 4 years, it was the single largest and most expensive project in the company's history to date. If it didn't succeed, it might just be the final nail in the coffin. But Blizzard put their faith in the game and hoped that they'd be able to sell 400,000 copies of the game in its first year on store shelves.
We had what by today's standards seemed like some very modest goals for ourselves. We had hardware infrastructure in North America to support about around 400,000 or 500,000 active subscribers, which we felt like if we achieved that in North America, we'd be successful and we could operate a successful business around the World of Warcraft game.
It sold that many in its first month. The MMO genre was still coming into its own. Entirely online with thousands of gamers all playing in one massive world, it was considered a niche market, with little presence in major territories like Europe. World of Warcraft blew those preconceptions away by becoming a global runaway success. One of the advantages of the genre was that it allowed the studio to charge a monthly subscription to play the game. This was necessary to offset the costs of making and maintaining the world. But the rates had been geared for profitability with a few 100,000 subscribers. Less than a year later, World of Warcraft had 4 million subscribers. These were unprecedented numbers. And with each one of them paying a monthly fee, it meant unprecedented revenue for a single game. Naysayers had said Blizzard was in trouble. Warcraft proved them wrong. Over the years, the popularity of the game only grew. Expansion packs made internally by the core Warcraft team would each become the fastest-selling PC title in history upon release. The subscriber base cleared 6 million, 8 million, 10 million, and has currently grown to 12 million paying customers. For one thing, this means the game has sold at least 12 million copies, But considering that a good number of players probably bought the game and then stopped subscribing at some point, the actual number of sales is likely much higher. For another, when all the various subscription fees around the world are tallied up, this means that the game earns roughly $1 billion per year in subscriptions alone. There has never been anything like it in the history of the medium. What made it so popular? As with other Blizzard products, there was nothing in the game that was truly brand new. It adhered closely to established MMO conventions, being a fantasy role-playing experience based on leveling up character stats and collecting items. But as with other Blizzard products, everything had been polished to perfection. Everything just worked intuitively, or if it didn't, it was quickly changed by Blizzard's balancing team. The art design was vibrant and accessible. The combat was considered the best in MMO history. And of course, the already golden name of Warcraft drew in a huge crowd from the get-go. All in all, World of Warcraft is yet another legend from a company that has already exceeded its quota for legendary games. Already at the peak of its industry, Blizzard had vaulted to heights few, if any, other game makers have ever reached. And with the windfall of profits from the game, Blizzard could now grow their company dramatically. Of course, they still had to continually support Warcraft, and this occasionally led to some issues. For all the success of their MMO juggernaut, it didn't help with any of their other projects.
We had to prioritize supporting the World of Warcraft community really above all else, especially in the early days of launching WoW. I think we almost certainly would have been able to finish StarCraft 2 faster if it weren't for the runaway success of WoW.
StarCraft 2, Diablo 3, and StarCraft Ghost were all trapped in development hell. And before any of them would see the light of day, the empire of Blizzard's many studios would collapse. Tune in next time to see Blizzard consolidate and then dominate. The 2000s had been rough on Blizzard Entertainment. A series of major resignations and projects that went nowhere seemed to signal the end of the juggernaut's reign. But all that changed in November 2004 with the release of World of Warcraft, a massively multiplayer online game that became more popular than anything anyone had ever seen before. Over the years, it grew to 12 million paying subscribers, one of the single largest revenue streams the industry had ever seen. In theory, this windfall should have allowed Blizzard to do whatever they wanted. Yet the popularity of the game had caught them off guard, and the company had scrambled to grow so it could both support Warcraft and work on other projects. They had plenty of unfinished games in the works, and once again, anything that didn't have Warcraft in the title met with massive delays and huge problems. The question was whether or not Blizzard could cope with its own success. Even as World of Warcraft was defying belief, Blizzard's other projects were floundering. Up at Blizzard North, Diablo 3 just couldn't get off the ground. Despite being the next game in the incredibly popular series, the sequel hadn't evolved with the times. The team just couldn't find a way to make the game fun. Worse, the graphics looked pretty dated by 2005, and the Blizzard North team had lost their leaders in a mass resignation in 2003. The project was in a free fall with no way out. In the end, Blizzard's executives in their southern base in Irvine, California, made a hard decision. They wanted to keep a tighter watch over their creative teams, and they couldn't do that from half a state away. So in August 2005, they shuttered Blizzard North. Their northern cousins were all given the option of moving down to Irvine to continue to work with Blizzard on Diablo. Some accepted the offer, and some didn't. But either way, it was a blow to a team that had become used to their own culture and creative independence. And it was one that Diablo 3 couldn't survive. With the closure of Blizzard North came the scrapping of the game they'd been working on. Diablo was restarted from square one. In typical Blizzard fashion, the game wasn't spoken of again for years. But 2005 also had some happy news for the company. October saw the world's first BlizzCon, a massive fan convention hosted by Blizzard itself. It allowed attendees to try out early builds of the first Warcraft expansion and StarCraft Ghost, their still-in-development console action game. It also allowed fans to meet up with their heroes who made the games they loved. The convention was a huge success, and while there was none in 2006, since 2007, BlizzCon has become an annual event. It has grown tremendously in size, and not coincidentally, Blizzard has not attended an E3 since 2009. They don't need to reach out to their community anymore. It comes to them.
Yeah, and then the other opportunity that we have nowadays is an event like BlizzCon, where we can actually show projects that might be even pre-alpha to the fans and give them an opportunity to experience it, but also give us an opportunity to take feedback from a very fresh set of eyes, because you only get one chance to take feedback from a first impression.
But despite it showing at that first BlizzCon, StarCraft Ghost was in for another setback. The Xbox 360 released in November 2005, and Blizzard knew that the PlayStation 3 and Wii would be releasing shortly afterwards. Their philosophy of delaying a game until it was perfect worked great on PCs, but had run into an unexpected consequence on consoles: a generation gap. StarCraft Ghost was still in production for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and original Xbox, which meant, suddenly, Blizzard had spent all that time and money on a last-gen title that wasn't even close to being done yet. By March 2006, the jig was up. Blizzard announced that the game was indefinitely postponed. It's still postponed today, but is effectively canceled. No one is working on the game anymore. The various team members were long ago assigned to either the Warcraft or Diablo teams. None of this stopped Warcraft's meteoric rise to dominance. In May 2006, Blizzard proudly announced that they had partnered with Hollywood movie studio Legendary Pictures to make a feature-length Warcraft film. Shortly thereafter, it was announced that Spider-Man director Sam Raimi had signed on to the project. And then, in typical Blizzard fashion, it went silent for a while. And now, nothing is known about it. Go figure. The years went by with a lot of Warcraft and not much else. But 2008 saw a huge change for the company, because major publisher Activision merged with Vivendi Games. Why does this matter, you ask? Well, in 1994, the young upstart Blizzard had been acquired by Davidson & Associates, which was later bought out by CUC International, which merged with HFS Corporation to become Senate, but after Senate was found guilty of accounting fraud, it sold off its entertainment division to French company Havas, which that same year was bought by Vivendi, which then, in December 2007, announced it would be merging with publishing juggernaut Activision in return for a majority holding in the ensuing company. Got all that? In July 2008, the deed was done. The newly formed super company was now the biggest in the game industry in sheer revenue. But this new joint venture, one half Activision and one half Vivendi, was not called Activision Vivendi. No, it was called Activision Blizzard. Blizzard had insisted on having their name in the top billing. In fact, they wanted the company to be called Blizzard Activision. In the end, Blizzard compromised and allowed the biggest single force in all of gaming to put their name first. That is how far Blizzard has risen. Blizzard has unprecedented autonomy within this joint venture, effectively managing itself as an independent studio that just informs Activision of its plans. To date, Activision has allowed this to go on. The smash success of Warcraft has kept them happy. Where the partnership will go in the future, only time will tell. With that independence, Blizzard has continued their philosophy of taking their time to get their games right. Even after the Ghost fiasco, the highly anticipated StarCraft 2 and Diablo 3 stayed under wraps for years.
I would say that even though we have these really popular franchises in Warcraft, StarCraft, and Diablo, if you look at our track record over the last 10 years or so, really you could make the argument that we've just been the Warcraft company. But the thing is that these franchises are so important to us and so important to our fans that it's really important that we deliver game experiences to our fans in the context of those universes. And honestly, I think we've been a little lax with it over the last 10 years, and our focus has been heavily on the Warcraft universe. So it's a really difficult balance to strike between, serving all three of these franchises and, the challenge of supporting World of Warcraft, which has been an immense undertaking for us in the last 6 or 7 years.
But finally, in July 2010, 12 entire years after the first StarCraft, StarCraft 2 released. It came with a huge non-linear campaign structure, a sweeping story told through cinematic cutscenes, and an adventure subgame, a revamped BattleNet service, deep support for the modding community, and of course, the world-famous multiplayer. 12 years is beyond an eternity in the gaming world, but between the unbelievably long-lived original and Blizzard's reputation, StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty went on to sell 1 million units in its first day and 3 million in its first month. compared to Warcraft, those numbers were so-so. Compared to anybody else, those numbers were amazing. But despite being released, StarCraft II isn't finished yet. The original StarCraft broke up the story into 3 different campaigns, one for the human race and one for each alien race. For StarCraft II, Blizzard is splitting up the story into 3 entirely separate games. The game out now, Wings of Liberty, only tells the human part. StarCraft II Heart of the Swarm is expected sometime in 2012, and after that, players will get to conclude the narrative in StarCraft II Legacy of the Void. How these games will differ from each other and what new features they will have to entice customers remains to be seen. In addition to these games, the future also holds the long-awaited Diablo 3. The game is close to completion now after a number of stops and restarts. The story takes place 20 years after the events of Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction, allowing it to be both a follow-up for old fans and a new beginning for new ones. The overall gameplay and style will adhere closely to the older games, with a top-down view of a powerful hero mowing down legions of enemies with his awesome gear. The art direction, however, has moved closer to Blizzard's other games after multiple iterations. Blizzard has also stated that recent action titles such as God of War have convinced the team to make the title more visceral, bringing the action back into action RPG. At the same time, they have stated that they want a heavier emphasis on character and story, bringing the RPG back into action RPG. It is expected in late 2011 or 2012. These are the only games that Blizzard was ready to announce to the world. But then, on November 30th, 2010, an internal document with a tentative release schedule leaked onto the internet. It made mention of games that no one had ever heard of before, including something with the working title Titan, scheduled for 2013. Reportedly, sensitive financial data was also included in the leak. Immediately afterwards, Blizzard's general manager in China was fired, and this is largely seen as confirmation that the leak is genuine. Indeed, Titan has now been confirmed by Blizzard as an active project. This will make it the first game from Blizzard that doesn't have Warcraft, StarCraft, or Diablo in the title since 1995.
We have started work on an unannounced MMO that we have said is not a sequel to World of Warcraft. It's something new and fresh, and we're trying to basically leverage all of our experience, all the lessons that we've learned over the past 6 years of running World of Warcraft, and come up with something fresh and new that pushes the MMO genre.
Beyond what was revealed in the leak, there are further rumors that Blizzard has yet another team working on yet another franchise. If so, then after nearly 10 years of nothing but Warcraft, Blizzard is starting to push its own boundaries once again. For certain, they have one team on Warcraft, one on StarCraft, one on Diablo, and one on Titan, and the possibility exists of another on the new game. If all goes according to plan, they will release multiple games across different franchises in the coming years, so that Blizzard becomes a company famous for a variety of games once again.
Hell, it's about time.
Lots of college graduates are ambitious, but even by that standard, the 3 guys who thought that they could make a successful entertainment company with no experience were just plain nuts. But starting with the first American-made game for the Super Nintendo, to reinventing the strategy genre, to inventing the action RPG, to redefining the upper boundaries of success, Blizzard Entertainment stands today as one of the most powerful forces in media. They have both complete independence and the backing of the biggest company in the industry. Their games are both respected critically and popular commercially. They've had their fair share of low moments and failed projects, and indeed their output over the last decade was largely swallowed by their MMO juggernaut. But with multiple teams rolling now, StarCraft 2 finally out, and more on the way, plus the upcoming Diablo 3 and Titan, Blizzard is in a stronger position now than they've ever been. They look like they've reached the very top. But any time that's ever been said of them before, they somehow find a way to climb even higher.